Here is our 50-year commemorative vignette for today. On or about March 28, 1945, in Germany, 9 Jewish women escape from the Ravensbrück concentration camp. They are rounded up by the Nazis and murdered the same day. We're going to talk about how we know what we know. What is the evidence of the Holocaust? Richard Paul spoke of the need that rational people have for evidence, clarity, accuracy, and relevance in the information and the arguments that they use and share. And today's speaker will tell us from a historian's perspective about the different kinds of clear, accurate, relevant evidence that we have of the Holocaust. He is Dr. Claudio Segre, professor of history at the University of Texas, Austin, and currently and teaching courses at UC Berkeley and Stanford. Correct? The formal introduction will be made by Professor Steve Watrous.
Our speaker today is Claudio Segre, who has written extensively on the Holocaust in Italy, on Italian anti-Semitism, and on the camp survivor Primo Levi, an Italian. In addition to his various scholarly articles, essays, and book reviews, he's had op-ed pieces on such topics as we've mentioned in such publications as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and the Jerusalem Post. Recently, from the UC Press in Berkeley, has come his prize biography on Italo Balbo, A Fascist Life, which is a study of the Italian fascist politician and aviator. It's available in paperback if you're interested. This September 1995, Viking Press will publish a memoir about his father, Emilio Segre, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and the book is to be entitled Atoms, Bombs, and Eskimo Kisses, to pique your interest. Mr. Segre is currently working on a study of Giulio Douhet, an Italian pioneer of air power. Mr. Segre is a native of Palermo, Italy, and he grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Berkeley, California. Before earning his PhD in history at UC Berkeley, he was a reporter with United Press International in Los Angeles and with the Wall Street Journal in San Francisco. He has been the recipient of many scholarly awards, and this includes a visiting fellowship at the National Air and Space Museum. For the last 25 years, he's been a professor of modern European history at the University of Texas at Austin, and this past year he's been a visiting professor of history in the fall semester at UC Berkeley, and the winter quarter at Stanford University, and now he's just conducting independent research on his own, and we're most fortunate to have Professor Claudio Segre with us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. I love to hear about it. I don't ever have any sense that I'm anything like that person. I'm just me, but it's nice to hear anyway. And I do very much want to thank my good friend Peter Molini, the chairman of the history department, Phil Baird, and those many of you involved in the Studies Center here for inviting me to talk about one of my certainly most favorite subjects. Not favorite because it's fun, but I think favorite because it is so terribly important. I'm sorry it's a spring day, a happy day, but I like to think that as I speak to you, I'm doing it not just for me, just for you, but also for my grandparents on both sides who perished in the Holocaust one way or another, and for those other millions who never lived to see this kind of spring day. How do we know what we know? Evidence of the Holocaust. How do we know what we know about the Holocaust? What evidence do we have to substantiate this historical tragedy? Well, that's my theme for today. It's a biggie, a real biggie, as I often tell my students, because it raises not just issues about the Holocaust, but also some of the most fundamental questions that any historian has to face. What is historical knowledge, and how do we acquire it? So I want to do three things this afternoon. First of all, there's the problem of historical knowledge. Now, Voltaire said, history is a pack of tricks that we play on the dead. And Henry Ford, and who are we to question Henry Ford? Henry Ford informed us that history is bunk. What if both Voltaire and Ford were right? How do we know what we know in history? Second, I want to review with you the evidence for the Holocaust. As you'll see, the amount is overwhelming. Yet, even if we have this plethora of evidence, how do we interpret it? How do we give it meaning? What do we mean by meaning? That's a very important question also. And finally, I want to examine a case study. I want to discuss with you the work of one famous Holocaust witness, a man who provided first-hand evidence of the Holocaust, and then struggled for the rest of his life to give that evidence meaning. I'm referring to the Italian writer and Holocaust survivor and witness, Primo Levi. You knew there had to be an Italian connection. There is. First of all, what does knowing mean for an historian? As any historian does, I take knowing, first of all, as collecting and knowing the facts. Auschwitz was a camp located in Poland. It covered so many square meters, kilometers. Between this date and that date, so many prisoners were housed in it. The barracks were of such and such a size. The camp provided so many liters per day per person. Those are all facts, or we can find out from the evidence that we have. We have no shortage of these kinds of facts about the Holocaust. We don't always know all we want to know about a specific topic, perhaps. But we have an overwhelming amount of material, and new evidence is constantly being discovered. Now, I want to point out about the evidence. I want to point out its enormous variety and its sources. First of all, the variety of evidence. And let me documents, the bread and butter for historians, old-fashioned historians like me. You always like to see a document. There are tons of them. There are Nazi records, the records of the perpetrators. There are train schedules, camp registers and books, business records, architectural drawings. For example, just to give you one example on the architectural drawings, which to you may seem kind of strange, but it's really a very valuable source. The Dutch-Canadian historian Robert Jan van Pelt, for example, has been working on the architectural drawings for Auschwitz. He found them in a Moscow archive, and with that he also found correspondence, business correspondence with the architects who built the camp. He found receipts from those who built the crematoria. He found invoices and so on. And of course, what he can do by comparing the different architectural plans is he can get a very clear idea then of how the camp evolved. Began, what its original concept was, and then what happened to it as the war developed. Some of you may have seen the architectural drawings on the PBS NOVA program called Nazi Designers of Death. Other documents we have Himmler's speeches to the SS. I saw one, we got a bit of one this afternoon in Peter Molini's class on the Holocaust. We have Nazi unit records of the SS and or the Einsatzgruppen. We have trial records. Those are the Nuremberg trials of 1946, that of the Eichmann trial, Auschwitz trials, and so on. All records. Other records, you might call them. We have diaries of the victims. I gather that you have an Anne Frank diary exhibit going on. Remember that has been just being issued now in a new and unedited version. We have memoirs of survivors like Primo Levi. I'll be talking about him shortly. So, diaries of the victims. We have Jewish records. records of the Jewish communities, Yizkor books, diaries of the Łódź ghetto, and so on. We have records of the bystanders. We have, for example, State Department records. We have their intelligence sources, wartime intelligence records, which show very clearly how much was known about the camps and about the Nazi programs at the time. Secondly, we have photographic evidence, not just those of the Allies when they first in the camps. For example, some of you may have seen recently a documentary called Memory of the Camps. This was something that was done by the British cameraman. It was housed for years in the Imperial War Museum. And it has a very dry, very low-key, absolutely devastating narrative by actor Trevor Howard. And this one is based on combat photographer footage, say, housed in the Imperial War Museum. We have for-the-record photos that the Nazis themselves made of the Warsaw Ghetto, recording their deeds for prosperity. Again, we saw for posterity. Again, we saw in this World at War documentary we saw this afternoon, there was lots of footage made by the Nazis. We have pictures of their open-air shootings. You know, who else was going to record this? Certainly not the victims. We have items such as aircrafts from the U.S. aerial reconnaissance teams. When they flew missions, they were flying other missions, but they also took in the camps. So this is some of the photographic evidence. We have artifacts. Museums like the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. have them, or the concentration camp museums, the artifacts ranging from the hair, the spectacles, the gold fillings, millions of shoes taken from the victims, tattered uniforms, prison badges, artwork. Remember that the Holocaust Museum in Washington has a railroad car. Some people have preserved things like the scrip from the Theresienstadt camp. The scrip was the money that was being used locally. The musical programs that were put on at that time in Theresienstadt when the Red Cross visited this so-called model camp. So these are just some of the artifacts, and I'm fascinated that John Steiner, of course, has his own collection of memorabilia. So lots of survivors would have things that they may well have preserved. So we've got artifacts. A fourth item we have, archaeological evidence. We have the ruins of the camps themselves. These, of course, are sometimes scant, part because the Nazis tried to destroy the evidence as they retreated and abandoned it. Finally, we have oral testimony. We have archives at Yale, for example. That's a famous one. Recordings of survivors. We have archives at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and many, many other museums. I'm just dropping these particular names, but there are many, many other sources. We also have testimony of many others. Simply oral testimony, some of it was recorded. For example, again, you'd see it in the Nuremberg, the testimony of the Nazis of the Nuremberg trials. The point here, then, is not just the varieties of evidence, but I do want to impress you with the varieties of evidence. They're the kinds of things that any historian could wish for. Everything from documents to oral testimony to archaeology to artifacts and so on. Not just the varieties of evidence, but sure of the sources. They don't just come from one end. They don't just tell one side of the story. They tell it's the Holocaust told from many different points of view, from the victims, from the perpetrators, and from the bystanders. I've given you some examples in discussing the documents or the photographic evidence. For example, we have the case of the liberating troops, the American liberating troops. General Eisenhower, when he first came upon these camps, that photographs be taken because he wanted to be sure that people would never question the reality of what was found. So we have General Eisenhower on the one hand, and the other hand we have the films of the Nazis themselves, those famous For the Record movies. Nor have we exhausted the sources. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the dissolution of East Germany, the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've come a whole new treasure trove of evidence. The Soviets themselves took all sorts of documents with them. And I already gave you the example of the architectural drawings at Auschwitz. Now, just recently, scholars working on Russian archives have come across all sorts of evidence on the behavior of one of the big German banks, the Deutsche Bank. You know, what was their policy towards the Jews in the early 1930s in Nazi Germany? Well, you can find that material in the Russian archives. So the amount of the facts, the raw materials of the Holocaust story, in many ways it's overwhelming. And there's far too much of evidence for the Holocaust to be simply explained away as an unfortunate byproduct of circumstances, one of the tragedies of war, and so on. That is not what the Holocaust was about, and the documents, the evidence prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. But knowing the facts alone isn't enough. Now, as I was talking to you now, I sort of watched your eyes glaze over a little bit as I talked about the millions of facts at our disposal. That's not what you're listening for. You don't care about the fact. You don't care about the actual number of how many liters of water were available per person in Auschwitz in 1944. You don't care about that any more than you care about the price of beans in Argentina in 1899. Your mind was already racing ahead, the fact, giving it some kind of meaning. And when you, for example, the question of the water ration, I really don't know what the number is. But what you want to know is you ask how that water ration compared to a normal person's intake. And if you find out that the prisoners are getting way below their minimum daily needs, then it gets interesting. You are giving that fact some kind of meaning. You begin to make judgments. What kind of camp is that? People aren't given enough water. What kind of living hell did that turn out to be? I see already you're starting to sit up and take note. We've given that fact meaning. It's telling us the things we want to know about the conditions of the camp, about the attitudes and policies of those responsible for the camps. So knowing something in an historical sense is more than simply having the facts. We also have to interpret the facts. And as we know all too well, we won't always agree on the meaning of the facts. Here, I want to remind you of 2 points, and I think this is really important. First of all, not all facts have meaning or interest. Sometimes we're simply not interested in them. We don't want to deal with them. And I want to remind you that that is essentially what happened with the Holocaust immediately after the war. In the immediate post-war period, there was very little interest in the topic. True, there were, for example, the Nuremberg trials, which brought out much of the story. But people were reluctant to discuss the Holocaust in a serious and scholarly fashion. Those of you who are survivors know the story all too well. But many of you students don't realize that. Historians, there were doubts about whether the Holocaust was really a legitimate field of study. Or if it was a legitimate field of study, just how important is it? Raoul Hilberg, for example, now certainly the dean of Holocaust studies, he had a terrible time getting his classic work, The Destruction of the European Jews. He had a terrible time getting that book published, not just because it was thick, not just because it was so damning, not because it was so incredibly thorough, but simply because publishers, I don't think anybody wants to know about this stuff. Nobody wants to hear about it. Well, I'm glad to say we've reached a very different stage now, and as Holocaust Studies Center here indicates, Holocaust studies are accepted as a full-fledged and important field of study. Major universities often have their own specialists in the field. Now, secondly, in discussing interpretation, each generation asks different questions of the material. Interpretations, emphases change through time. Interpretations may change as new evidence becomes available. Just give you another example. For example, Hilberg, in his Destruction of the European Jews, Hilberg was busy basically studying the bureaucracies, the bureaucratic machinery for destruction. That was his great contribution. Now, another historian, Chris Browning, has done a much more specific work, done many things, but has been a much more specific work, a brilliant investigation of one particular unit, one particular annihilation unit of an Einsatzgruppen, an execution unit, one of the Einsatzgruppen. You know, who were the people who belonged in it? How did they work together? Why were they doing these horrible things? How could they continue to do these horrible things? So, a kind of micro-study. Another example of changing interpretations would be the debate between the intentionalists and the functionalists in explaining the origins of Nazi Holocaust policies. Now, the argument centers around whether Nazi Holocaust policies and procedures were clear and unequivocal from the beginning of the Nazi accession to power. That is, all you had to do was read Mein Kampf and you could see the blueprint right there. Or whether the Nazis, that's the intentionalist argument, or whether the Nazis had a general idea about what they wanted to do, that is, they wanted to do something about the so-called Jewish problem, but they didn't quite know how to implement it. And that is the functionalist idea. The functionalist would argue that the Nazis kind of bumped along in the dark, trying this, trying that. First came legal exclusions, then deportations, then finally, under the particular circumstances of war, on physical extermination. Now, there's evidence for both sides, both for the intentionalists and the functionalists. That's part of scholarly debate. The important point here is that no matter which side you're on, there's no room for debate here. There's no dispute among serious scholars about whether the Holocaust happened. What scholars are trying to better to understand in the process is simply how it happened. Finally, in discussing how we know what we know, I want to raise the question of meaning. Now, we can understand meaning on many levels. There's the purely historical level. The facts as a bit of evidence to explain how things happened. But something like the Holocaust raises another level of meaning. When we confront the Holocaust, almost instinctively, we raise moral and ethical questions that historians aren't always accustomed to addressing directly. With the Holocaust, we feel that we are in the presence of some fundamental moral force. We are staring at evil. And let me just give you an example of that. I went to a very memorable conference outside of Texas, Salado, Texas, about an hour north of Austin, where there was a conference dedicated simply to the topic evil. And they invited all sorts of people. Maya Angelou was there, and there were theologians, and Barbara Jordan was there, and all sorts of people, academics and so on. Now, nobody knew what evil was, in the sense that nobody could define it. Nobody could give a really dictionary definition, because there would being in with a bunch of high-powered intellects and scholars and so on, everybody could find some way of arguing that's not a good definition. But almost everybody agreed on the story of evil, examples of evil. And the example that came up time and time again was the Holocaust. Everybody agreed on that one. So that's what I mean about this kind of fundamental moral concern. We're staring at evil, but how do we deal with the questions that arise on this level? If we're religious, we ask ourselves, what happened to God that he would allow such unspeakable acts? Of course, more questions for theologians than for historians, and yet we don't have to be specialists. We certainly don't have to have a degree in divinity to sense the presence of these questions, the problem of meaning at that level. How do we deal with them? That, too, is part of the question in asking, how do we know what we know? Well, these are daunting problems. Rather than addressing them directly myself, I thought it might be useful to deal with them by example. Perhaps we could study the particular case of someone who was particularly well equipped as a survivor and a witness to the Holocaust to grapple with these issues. Now, for my case study, as I've told you, I've chosen one of the most famous of the Holocaust memoirists and witnesses, Primo Levi. Primo Levi, L-E-V-I. His dates are 1919 to 1987. Now, you may remember his story. As he was 25, when he was captured by the Italian fascists in December 1943, he was shipped off to Auschwitz, where he spent about 11 months before he was liberated. After the war, he went back to his native Turin, where he worked as a chemist in a paint factory, and he embarked on his career as a writer. His most famous works are his memoirs that relate to his experiences during the Holocaust. And the titles are, the most famous one is Survival in Auschwitz. Survival in Auschwitz. It's the English version. I much prefer the original title, the Italian one, Se questo è un uomo, If This Is a Man. Another famous one he did was called The Truce, or The Reawakening. And finally, the other great memoir he did was called The Periodic Table. The Periodic Table. But he's well known for his collections of essays about the Holocaust, his novels, his short stories, and his poetry, all with Holocaust themes. Now, why is Primo Levi a study? Well, first of all, he was there. He spent 11 months in Auschwitz. He experienced the facts firsthand. Secondly, it's instructive to study him because he was an unusually skilled and talented interpreter of these facts. He was not simply a survivor. He was quite consciously and quite deliberately a witness. In this case, I'm using witness in a special way. It's not just that he was there. He also chose, when he returned home, to witness in a special sense, to tell of his experiences in a way that goes beyond merely personal recollection. He wanted to tell the story for those who could not, and of course he desperately wanted to find meaning in his experience. So what can we add to our knowledge of the Holocaust by studying Primo Levi? Well, first of all, Levi broadens and enlarges our geographical and temporal vision of that historical epoch or movement that we call the Holocaust. All too often of the Holocaust, we're accustomed to a fairly restricted geographical view. It's quite natural. I really thank you very much for bringing the map here. When we think of Holocaust, by and large, we think of Germany, Poland, Russia. We're thinking mostly about this area. Okay? But what Primo Levi does, of course, is to broaden them. He reminds us that the Holocaust, once the Germans occupied Italy, the Holocaust spread into southern Europe, into Greece, Yugoslavia, and all too often we've forgotten that the Holocaust really extended into North Africa, to Tunisia, into Morocco. Moroccan Jews, they were Tunisian Jews. Most of them were rounded up, put in labor camps. They were very lucky. There were no rail lines across the Mediterranean. I think that really, as simple-minded as that may be, I think that was a major factor that saved them. But they were discriminated against, very clearly. So the Holocaust universe, I think, is much, much larger, much more extensive, I think, than we normally consider it. We also tend to restrict the Holocaust in time, from 1943 to 1945. I think we often think in those terms. Now, from our vantage point today, we can see clearly that the story does not end with the liberation of the camps, does not end with the destruction of the Third Reich. God, I wish it had ended. It stretches far beyond the chronological period, 33 to 45, because in its wake, the Holocaust left a tangle of issues, social and psychological problems of survivors. I'm sure you've heard of that in this lecture series. Broken families, second-generation members, economic and political problems, such as reparations to the victims and to the creation of the State of Israel, and so on. So Levi helps us, I think, by reminding us that his most important part of his career really was beyond the 1945. It was after liberation. That's really one of his major contributions. Secondly, Levy's example has much to tell us about the process of interpreting the Holocaust, about giving meaning to those facts that we've. Now, Levy often knew, of course, what the facts were firsthand. That didn't make it any easier for him, as I'm going to illustrate. It didn't make it any easier for him to understand what those facts meant, how the Holocaust came about, or what its ultimate significance was. Well, let me deal with the first issue, how he broadens our geographical and temporal views of the Holocaust. First of all, he does provide a splendid insight into Holocaust, what we could call the Holocaust periphery. The Italian Jewish community under fascism, his community. Through his memoirs, especially through the periodic table, we come to understand, we glimpse the story of the Italian Jews. We come to understand their attitudes as Jews. We comprehend how and why, as with so many other Jewish communities, they failed to anticipate the catastrophe that awaited them. So let me give you some of the facts, just as Primo Levi gives us the facts through his memoirs. Remember how small the Italian Jewish community was? About 40,000. About 0.1% of the population. As a basis of comparison, remember I'm giving you a figure about 1938. As a basis of comparison, during this period, the French Jewish population was about 350,000, about less than 1% of the total French population. The Jews in Yugoslavia, 76,000, or about none of the population. In Greece, also about 76,000. Holland, 140,000. Of course, these communities of Western Europe were tiny compared to the 3.1 million Jews, nearly 10% of the total population, that lived in Poland, and the 2.5 million who lived in USSR. So you can understand, why the focus is naturally on Eastern Europe. Now, by and large, Italian Jews were well-educated, secularized, assimilated into the Italian middle class. By the end of the 19th century, Jews had reached high positions in society. In politics, they served as premiers, they served as finance ministers. In the military, Italy's first Jewish general served as an instructor to the future Italian king. And no less than 50 Jewish generals served in the Italian army during World War I. That tells you something about the nature of Italian society and of how easily the Jews related into that particular world. In that particular climate, most Italian Jews, like Levi, felt that they were Italians first, Jews second. Levi's family background mirrored the attitudes of that larger community. His father was an engineer who went to services on Yom Kippur from time to time because it was the polite thing to do. Occasionally he ate ham with the air of saying, "I'm sinning," as he said to Primo Levi, "I'm sinning because the flesh is weak, but don't you do it." Levi's mother was even more secular, though she too observed various rituals, such as buying matzahs for Pesach. She arranged annual seders for the grandparents, and so on. Levi did it. He completed his bar mitzvah, and for a couple of years he was even sort of very religious, but always ruthlessly honest with himself. He also remembered that he had a special reason for being so religious. He thought if he was very good, that he would get a bicycle, that God would give him a bicycle. Now, ironically, what gave the Italian Jews then their sense of being apart were the fascist racial laws of 1938. Remember how these racial laws came about? Nazis came to power. January of 1933, Hitler is in power. Almost immediately, anti-Semitic legislation. Almost immediately, discrimination began. Mussolini came to power in 1922. No anti-Semitic legislation until very late in the regime, 1938. So what the racial laws promulgated then what at first had been simply what Primo Levi called, and I'm quoting him, a cheerful little anomaly that he was Jewish, between him and his Christian friends turned out to be a source of discomfort on both sides once those racial laws passed in Italy. While no one, neither professor nor student, directed any, these are Levi's words, any hostile word or gesture toward him, unquote. He felt that they were keeping their distance, and he responded in kind. Isolated and lonely, cast out as what he called impure, he, and again these are his words, he began to be proud of his impurity. Nevertheless, when he joined the armed resistance, motivated far more by secular and humanistic ideologies than he was by any kind of Jewish religious and cultural traditions. Foremost among these were the secular ideologies of Risorgimento liberalism. Remember, Italy was united in 1870, and the kind of 19th century liberalism, the stress on the individual, the stress on democratic government, the stress on parliaments, free trade, property rights, that kind of liberalism, that was really what motivated him. That kind of liberalism was what motivated him much more than any kind of religious motivation. So how and why then did Levi and his contemporaries, because many of his contemporaries, they either followed this kind of liberal ideology, secular ideology, and some of them, of course, also turned communist. If they can, then why did they consider themselves Jews? And let me give you a quote then from one of the founders of the fascist movement, Justice and Liberty, the one that Levi joined as a partisan, in which this man tried to explain how and why he felt that he was Jewish. I call myself a Jew, said this man, Nello Rosselli. I call myself a Jew because the monotheistic conscience is indestructible in me, because every even disguised form of idolatry repels me, because I regard with Jewish serenity the mystery of beyond the tomb, because I love all men as in Israel it was commanded, and I have therefore that social conception which it seems to me descends from our best traditions. So a very secular kind of ideology, a very abstract one. Now for Levi himself then, the racial laws and his concentration camp experiences proved absolutely decisive in determining his Jewish identity. As he said, without them, I'd probably no longer be a Jew except for my last name, quote. The dual experience, he said, stamped me in the way that you stamp a steel plate. At this point, he said, at this point I'm a Jew. They've sewn the Star of David on me and not only on my clothes, unquote. Despite the racial laws in 1938, like many of his generation, Levi came to anti-fascism relatively late, really in 1943. As he memoir, The Periodic Table, Italian fascism, that is the dictatorship, was just strong enough to anesthetize and to alienate an entire generation from politics. And when you ask yourself, for example, why weren't people doing things under the Nazis? Why weren't young people active under the Nazis? You've got to remember, there is a police regime going on. The schools are completely covered by Nazi ideology. There is an official line. It's very hard for any bright young person to really understand then what ought to be done. And the same thing then happened with Primo Levi. Fascism had its effect on us, he said, as on almost all Italians, alienating us and making us superficial, passive, cynical. That is, what he's saying is basically he opted out of politics. There wasn't much he could do, so I'm out. In another passage, Levi describes a typical young Italian of his generation. Quote, he talked about fascism and the war with reticence and a sinister gaiety that I had no trouble interpreting. It was the ironic gaiety of a whole generation of Italians, intelligent and honest enough to reject fascism, too skeptical to oppose it actively, too young to passively accept the tragedy that was taking shape and to despair of the future. unquote. Halfway through the war, until the German defeat at Stalingrad during the winter of 1942-43, until the collapse of the fascist regime in July of 1943, Levy's attitude was, as he called it, passive, limited to rejection, isolation, avoiding contamination. The seed of active struggle, that is the seed of anti-fascist struggle, had not survived down to us, unquote. Problems was that the whole earlier generation of anti-fascists had all been arrested or exiled. Levy and his friends discovered, quote, we had to begin from scratch to invent our anti-fascism, create it from the germ, from the roots, from our roots. Well, we looked up roads that led not far away. Sources, what did he turn to for inspiration? Well, the Talmud, to the Italian philosopher, historian Croce, to geometry, to physics, mathematics, and the sciences, in particular the sciences and mathematics, because they demanded rigorous proof and demonstration. And as disciplines, they were materialist, as opposed to the fascist philosophical belief in idealism. So, as Levy put it, these disciplines, quote, seem to us sources of certainty, unquote. Yet Levy's long period of political cynicism and indifference left its mark. He and his friends had no more faith in the Allies than they did in the fascists. And here I'm quoting, the Allies were masters of the sky. Perhaps in the end they would win and fascism would end. But it was their business. They were rich and powerful. They had airplane carriers and the Liberators, the Liberator bombers, but not us. They had declared us different we would be, unquote. So, with the collapse of the fascist regime and the German occupation, Levy and his friends were finally aroused to action. Now, this is the fall then of 1943. He decided to join the partisans. He added ruefully, thinking about his material and ideological preparation, quote, we were the most disarmed partisans in Piedmont, in northern Italy, and we were the most disarmed and the most unprepared, unquote. Well, his career in the armed resistance was brief. With the German, he took to the hills in September of 1943, and then he was captured in December. It's significant. At the time of his capture, Levy was still so uncertain about the meaning of the German occupation. Remember what happened? The fascist regime, Italian fascist regime collapsed, and the Italians signed an armistice with the Allies. In the meantime, the Germans simply occupied most of the country. Levy was so uncertain about the meaning of the German occupation, he didn't know whether to admit that he was a partisan or that he was a Jew. He concluded it would go easier on him if he admitted he was a Jew. That's the kind of thinking that his memoirs illustrate. Thus, Levy's memoirs, then, broaden our geographical view of the Holocaust universe by telling us about the attitudes and the customs of the Italian Jewish community, especially, of course, a particular strata of the community, the educated middle class. Now, Levy also broadens and deepens our understanding of the Holocaust through his accounts of his experience in Auschwitz. Beginning in February of 1944, spent 11 months there until Russian troops liberated him in January of 1945. And I've already told you about the memoirs. That is, I've given you their titles. In these memoirs, he tells us with astonishing detachment and detail just what happened in the camps, literally how it was. In many ways, these memoirs are like primary sources. In an unforgettable way, they tell us about the facts of camp life from an inmate's point of view. When he first began to write, he tells us, he had no idea what he was doing. He simply felt a deep need, as many survivors do, a deep need to tell the story. Like many camp survivors, he was terrified. He was absolutely terrified that no one would listen to him. So he took as his writing model the short end-of-the-week report that he wrote for the paint company where he was working. At the end of the week, works for the paint company, end of the week, well, Dr. Levy, what have you done for us this week? You write up a short report. That was his model. He tells us then about his experiences in Auschwitz, with giving us important insights into the politics and sociology of the camps, into the craft of. As a writer, I think he's at his best as a memoirist. He's an artist with the anecdote, with the telling bit of memory. In the literature of the camps, as far as I'm concerned, there's nobody better. What could be more substantial, concrete, than this passage about getting up in the morning? Let me quote this. And just listen to how concrete he is, how he tells you what it was like, how he gives you the details, and how there's a bit of humor in it also. He makes you understand, as any great writer does, he makes you understand, he makes you feel what it was like to be in these camps. Well, this is how things go in the morning. When reveille sounds, and it's still pitch dark, first of all, we put on our shoes. Otherwise, somebody will steal them, and it's an unspeakable tragedy. Then in the dust and crush, we try to make our beds according to regulations. Immediately after that, we rush to the latrines and the washroom, run to get bread. And finally, we make a dash to the roll call square. We join our work squads and wait for the head count to end and for the sky to grow lighter. One by one in the dark, the ghosts who are our companions approach. Our squad is a good one. We have a certain esprit de corps. There is no clumsy or whining rookies among us. Among us exists a rough friendship. In the morning, it's customary for us to greet one another formally. Good morning, Herr Doctor. Good morning, Signor Lo. How was your night, Mr. President? Did you enjoy your breakfast? But as a witness, Levy is not content with telling us how it was for him alone. He isn't merely dictating his own story. He wants his memoirs to have a much broader, universal kind of significance. He makes it clear that the tragedy of the camps is not just a Jewish one. It's a human tragedy. The barbed wire of the camps encloses the representatives from all the nations of Europe, as indeed they did at Auschwitz. The camp buzzes with a babble of languages. Furthermore, with his allusions to the Bible, to the slavery of the past, to literary classics like Dante, Levy shows both that the catastrophe has its predecessors in the slavery of the past, but at the same time, this event is unique, without precedent. He does both. He encompasses it within human history. It's a very important theme for me. He encompasses it within human history, so shows the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And I think it's this breadth of vision that distinguishes his memoirs from that of other Holocaust writers. Levy's are not merely literature of the Holocaust, they are one of the few examples of genuine Holocaust literature. Now, Levy doesn't just give us the facts about his experiences. His memoirs and essays reveal his struggles to make sense out of the facts. And that's what really interests us. How did he struggle with those facts? What did he do with them? His career and his works raise the problems of being a survivor and of the difficulties of memory, the difficulties of interpretation. In many ways, as I said before, his career after the liberation was the most difficult and by far, for my money, the most heroic of his life. Levy made light of his career as a resistance fighter and a partisan during the war. Probably so. It was a short time. For him, the resistance began when he returned home and when he dedicated the rest of his life to keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive. As he wrote in his memoir, The Reawakening, the account of his long odyssey back from the camps, his witnessing began at the moment of his liberation. Quote, "We knew that on the thresholds of our homes, for good or ill, a trial awaited us, and we anticipated it with fear. Soon, tomorrow, we should have to give against enemies still unknown, outside ourselves and inside. With what weapons? What energies? What willpower? The months just past of wandering on the margins of civilization now seem to us like a truce, hence the title, La Tregua, the truce. He saw himself as carrying on a fight that began with the last days of the war, when the SS's main concern was that prisoners would not survive to tell the story. Cynical SS militiamen enjoyed admonishing the prisoners. And here I'm quoting. What the SS guards said was, however this war may end, we've won the war against you. None of you will be left to bear witness. But even if someone were to survive, the world will not believe him, unquote. So Levy devoted the rest of his life, more than 4 decades, to bearing witness, to perpetuating the memory of the Holocaust, to meditating on its significance. Levy wrestled with the facts of his own life and with the Holocaust in general, mainly through his writing, his memoirs, poems, his journalism, his fiction, but he also spoke in public. He was also interviewed. Again, there was a little clip in Professor Molini's documentary today, a little clip of Primo Levi. He spoke in public. He made visits to the campsites. He carried on a lively correspondence with both the persecuted and the persecutors. As a witness, his attitude towards the Holocaust puzzled and sometimes alienated readers, especially those who wanted to see him of Italian Elie Wiesel. First of all, Levy viewed his Holocaust experiences with a calm equanimity, a calm and an equanimity that offended some readers. Friends and admirers spoke of Levy's, quote, detachment, unquote. That's the first thing that strikes you when you read his memoirs. How could this man write about these things so dispassionately? His natural curiosity and his scientific, remember he was a chemist, led him to perceive the concentration camps as gigantic social experiments, thus perhaps unconsciously mirroring the views of some of his captors. In the preface to Survival in Auschwitz, he noted that the book was intended, quote, to furnish documentation for a quiet study of certain aspects of the human mind, unquote. Yet his calm, his detached tone, his, quote, denatured pseudoscientific pose, unquote, as one American did, offended some readers. Where was his rage? Where was his indignation? Parenthetically, I'll tell you, his rage, his indignation is all in his poems. It's not in the memoirs, but it's very clearly in his poems. Moreover, unlike Elie Wiesel, Levy viewed the Holocaust not as an essentially Jewish phenomenon, but as a universal one. The captors and the captives, the masters and the slaves, transcended religious and ethnic groups and national boundaries. His message to Jews in particular was, we suffered because we were Jews, but our sufferings were not peculiarly Jewish. We suffered as others did. We suffered as men. So in tone and argument, Levy's perspective recalls that, perhaps, of Alain René's Holocaust documentary, Night and Fog. Seen that one, Alain René, Night and Fog. If you haven't seen that one, you've got to see it. Anybody who's trying to get a GE requirement, that should be right in there in the curriculum, Night and Fog. Like Levy's work, Alain René's film is low-key, melancholy, detached. Like Levy, Alain René argues that the Holocaust was not something limited to a specific time and space, a series of events that occurred long ago and far away. Like Levy, René's potential for evil, for another Holocaust in all of us. Ironically, despite their apparent scientific detachment, neither man is a psychologist really or a social theorist. Both are old-fashioned moralists warning us about the evil in the nature of man. Yet Levy's message is not one of despair. His great strength in writing about the Holocaust lies precisely in what some readers and critics found offensive, in that clear, calm, detached tone of his prose works. It's a tone with many attractions, timeless, dispassionate, lacking in rancor, hysteria, or self-aggrandizement. As best he can, with a wealth of detail and concrete images, he tells us what Auschwitz was like. His perspectives make the Holocaust manageable, give it a human and historical dimension, a tragedy perpetrated by men on other men. Survival in Auschwitz was about Levy's experiences in the lager, but more important, William's original title, the original title was, If This Is a Man, what that indicates is what the book was about. The questions that Levy was raising were, What did it mean to be a man? What did it mean to be human? Now, Levy is also a guide and a case study to the mentality and the limitations of the witness's vision. Now, as historians, we're always interested in the people that we're studying, what kinds of limitations do they have? What kinds of biases might they have? We always have to evaluate the evidence. So, Levy is a good guide to discussing the mentality and limitation of the witness, of a witness's vision. The role of a witness is always a difficult and ambitious and ambivalent one. On the one hand, a witness is expected to simply report, to tell what he saw, what he or she saw or experienced. Yet to be truly memorable, the witness has to go beyond a mere chronicle of events. You'd be bored to death if there were simply a chronicle of events. He or she also has to explain why the events happened and what they meant. In short, the witness has to judge, has to give meaning. Levy filled the first role brilliantly. The second, he resisted and carried out only with great reluctance, as we'll see. He could report. He had a hard time making judgments, finding meaning. As a reporter-observer, he succeeded. The role agreed with his temperament. It agreed with his scientific background. His restless curiosity, his training as a chemist gave him the detachment to examine, to question, to describe all of his experiences, including the horrors of the camps. However, if we are seeking answers to the ultimate question, why the Holocaust happened, or what its meaning was, then the limits of his vision become apparent. He was reluctant to take on such issues. I think probably we're asking too much of him. But he was reluctant to take on the issues. He felt that it was, quote, inopportune, not to say importunate, to take on the place of a judge, unquote. He begged his readers not to look for, quote, unquote, messages in his works. He distrusted the seer, he said. At best, he wanted to state the facts. He wanted to leave the conclusions to his readers. Yet in the act of writing his books, in his selections of materials, in his tone, he did judge. We always want to be aware of that when we're figuring out how do we know what we know, how do we work as historians. Stating the facts, the tone, the way you arrange them, all of that becomes enormously important. As one interviewer pointed out, quote, the kind of difficult task that you perform through your narrative consists in leading the reader by the hand to experience a certain reaction and pronounce a certain condemnation without saying it yourself, unquote. Now, these implicit messages in his memoirs, then, are probably more satisfactory than his explicit one. As a hostile critic noted, Levy's historical explanation of the Holocaust, for example, is surprisingly simplistic, as this critic commented. And I've deliberately repressed her name. I'm so angry with her. She called him, his interpretation was based on, quote, hackneyed social psychology, unquote. In Levy's view, the Holocaust, the camps, were primarily a German phenomenon, the result of mass psychosis, propaganda, Hitler's personality. As he explained in an interview with his friend, the writer Ferdinando Camon, the early decades of the 20th century was, quote, a period of strong personalities, unquote, especially Hitler, Stalin, and Churchill. But not, although Levy doesn't explain why, he leaves out Mussolini. Here's a little bit of the interview. Come on. You mean heroes who made everyone's will a continuation of their own will? Yes, says Levy. I'd really say so. And why did the Germans accept Hitler? Levy comments. Well, I've read a lot of books, even by famous historians, and I find they've all thrown up their hands at this problem, the problem of consensus, the mass consensus in Germany. All you can say of those who rejected Hitler is that they didn't accept him enthusiastically, unquote. My own perception, he said, was that the camps had to do with madness, a kind of methodical madness. Well, according to, where did this madness come from? According to Levy, the madness was propaganda. Here I'm quoting him. It's the first case in history in which an especially powerful and violent man, a tyrant, found himself in possession of the spectacular weapons of mass communication, unquote. And why did this phenomenon arise in Germany, you ask Levy? Well, he comes perilously close to accepting a kind of devil theory of German history. You know, the Germans were cursed, that sort of stuff. And here I'm quoting him. I had a distinct impression in witnessing the rise of Nazism in Germany and experiencing it first and then reading about it later. The impression of a curse, of something demonic. He spoke of it a moment ago, of the devil as a constant in German culture, being embodied in Hitler, unquote. And again, quote, yes, the devil is a fundamental presence in their upbringing, unquote. But ultimately, Levy, of course, was an intelligent man, and he rejected the notion. He says, quote, any overall judgment on the intrinsic, innate qualities of a people, to me, smells of racism. I mean to be immune to it, even if sometimes to make an effort. Well, the limits of Levy's interpretation are obvious. His focus is almost entirely on Germany, about Italy, about Mussolini, about the racial laws. He has virtually nothing to say. In effect, he continues the standard view of Italian fascism as a lightweight regime and of Mussolini as a dictator without the aura and authority of a Stalin or a Hitler or a Churchill. The racial laws were an obscenity, but for the most part, according to Levy, no one in Italy took them seriously. If we look for, again, looking for meaning, if we seek deep moral or theological insights into the Holocaust, Levy really isn't much more satisfactory. As a secular Jew, as a scientist, he had what we might call a tin ear for religion. Moreover, as he told an interviewer, quote, the experience of Auschwitz has been such as to sweep away any remnant of religious education I had had. There is Auschwitz, and so there cannot be a God. Well, how are we to explain the limitations of his vision, this vision of a witness? The power of his direct narrative and his implicit judgments, the weakness of his explicit judgments. Well, one factor, as I pointed out above, is his temperamental reluctance to judge. Levy was by nature a modest man. He was very wary of assuming the prophet's mantle. Another factor that complicated his vision is his identity of roles. He is at once a scientist, an artist, and a witness. The three viewpoints often conflict with each other, and they help perhaps explain the tensions and the limits of his work. Levy the scientist was always scrupulous to note only what he had personally observed. He wrote about what he knew. His attitudes, as he described them in the periodic table, reflected his middle-class, secular, apolitical formation under fascism. His prose, too, derived from his training as a scientist and served him well. Simple language, concreteness, clarity. The detachment of the scientist or the paint company executive writing his weekly report, whereas these were his most persuasive tools. Quiet reflection, that's his term. Quiet reflection was his best hope of convincing his readers that the Holocaust had been real, not simply some distant, aberrant part of human experience. His training as a scientist then steered away from those grand pronouncements or those elaborate theories and all that and passionate rhetoric. Yet Levy was also a writer, and he was an artist. And as such, he did not lack literary imagination, as we see in his other works, and he did not hesitate to speculate or to take liberties when it suited him. After the war, for example, investigated aspects of the Holocaust and of the Jewish tradition that he didn't know anything about. Because witnesses, too, have to find out about the big picture. They have to. So he studied the material about the Jewish partisans in Poland and Russia, about which he knew nothing, so that he could write a novel, which was called If Not Now, When? Nor was he above embroidering, combining themes and personalities in a way that best made his point. One of his friends said, Primo was above all an artist, but in no way can he be considered a historian. Thus, Levy's scientific training tempered his literary and speculative imagination, yet that training alone, I don't think, is enough to explain the limits of his vision. Now, Levy was not only an artist and a scientist, he was also a survivor and a witness with the psychological needs that those those latter roles imply. As a witness, he didn't want to take sides. He wanted to be above partisan politics. Moreover, he suffered from the guilt, of course, that so many camp survivors suffer from. Always ruthlessly honest, he insisted that he survived the camps through nothing more than a series of fortunate circumstances. In the camps, he told interviewers, his resistance had been, quote, like that of a reef or a rock that resists the power of water in a stream. I am not a strong man, not at all, unquote. Those who survived, he declared, quote, never fathomed the bottom, unquote. If he had survived, at whose expense had it been? And here I'm quoting him, it is no more than a supposition, indeed the shadow of a suspicion, that each man is his brother's Cain, that each one of us has usurped his neighbor's place and lived in his stead. It is a supposition, but it gnaws at us. It is nestled like a woodworm. Quote. Meanwhile, the potential for a recurrence of the Holocaust haunted him. Quote, how much of the concentration camp world is dead and will not return, like slavery and the dueling code? How much is back or is coming back? What can each of us do so that in this world, pregnant with threats, at least this threat will be nullified, unquote. At the same time, the standards he set for himself as a witness were impossibly high. Had he done, he asked himself constantly, had he fulfilled his vocation as a witness? His inabilities to communicate with the new generations suggested to him that perhaps he had not done enough. Quoting, for us to speak with the young becomes ever more difficult. We see it as a duty at the same time as risk, the risk of appearing anachronistic, of not being listened to. We must be listened to, above and beyond our personal experiences. Collectively, we witnessed a fundamental, unexpected event, fundamental precisely because unexpected, not foreseen by anyone. It happened. Therefore, it can happen again. That is the core of what we have to say, unquote. Given these enormous psychological pressures as a survivor and a witness, maybe Levy needed to maintain a certain psychological distance from his story, peering over the edge, pondering the evil directly, the millions of sacrifice, the potential for a recurrence. Perhaps that was more than he could bear. Hence, better for him to focus on the narrative, on the telling, rather than the speculating or confronting directly the questions of explanation and meaning. Eventually, the burdens of being a witness, as well as personal problems, him. On April 13th, 1987, one of the saddest days of my life personally, April 13th, 1987, for the partisan, as he called himself, whose war, he claimed, was never over, the war ended at last. Some of you may know what happened to Primo Levi. It was a sad day for me because that day I happened to be flying into Milan. I opened up the newspapers and I read the headlines which said Primo Levi had committed suicide. He had thrown himself down a flight of stairs. To this day, we still don't really know what the story is. He had been very depressed at the end of his life. He had been depressed precisely for some of the reasons I've been talking about. He felt he hadn't done enough. New generations were coming up. They didn't know the story, and he felt he hadn't done enough. Instead of accepting the fact that new generations come up and we have to keep on retelling, thought that somehow he could make that impression that everybody would take the Holocaust the way he had taken it. That, I think, was very fundamental to him. He also felt that he had personal problems. He felt he is written out. He had some personal problems with he had an aged mother. He had a mother-in-law and so on, some physical problems and so on. All of them apparently combined to eventually to precipitate this tragic death. Of all the people in the world, particularly for me, people in the world, for so many Italian Jews, the one thing you wanted to believe in was Primo Levi. He had survived. He had made it through. He had lived. He had done it. And at the end, something happened. He hadn't quite made it. So one of the saddest days of my life. In conclusion then, how do we know what we know about the Holocaust? How does the example of Primo Levi help us? Well, as I pointed out, knowing in history doesn't simply mean gathering the facts. We need to interpret them. We need to give them meaning. And I use meaning here in the senses that I've explained, the historical level, how things come about, but also, especially in the case of the Holocaust, meaning on this moral or metaphysical level, a kind of visceral, direct understanding, a feeling for the meaning of this event. Well, Primo Levi serves us marvelously as a guide and a case study in our struggle to know about the Holocaust. On one level, he does give us the facts. His memoirs are primary evidence about just what happened in the camps from the view of a witness. By reading them, by their clear, detached, calm, almost scientific tone, we are once again reminded of the realities of the Holocaust. It wasn't one of those massacres that occur from time to time in history. It wasn't an unfortunate byproduct of war. As any careful reading of Levi's accounts show us, the Holocaust was a result of a deliberate and systematic policy by the Nazi government and that of their allies to exterminate its enemies, the Jews in particular, but also other ethnic groups and minorities. As I pointed out, the evidence that supports Levi's view is overwhelming, both in its variety and in its sources, from archaeology to oral testimony, and victims, perpetrators, bystanders all attest to the Holocaust's reality. If we are sure that the Holocaust happened, we're not always sure how it happened. We'll always be trying to fathom the Holocaust's contours, much as Primo Levi did. Was it a question of mass psychosis? Were the new tools of mass media enough to explain what happened? Was it the kinks and twists of German history? How could people allow the horrors of the Holocaust to happen? That question, that last one, leads us to the most difficult one of all. What did the Holocaust mean? And here Primo Levi again is a splendid guide to our perplexities. The meaning of such evil overwhelmed him, perhaps as it overwhelms many of us. There is no Auschwitz, and so there cannot be God, he remarked. How could these things happen? He had no answers. He could reach no satisfying explanations. The best thing he could do, he concluded, was to tell the story. To tell the story as best he knew how, and it was a duty that he had. In the end, like Primo Levi, we too have trouble coming up with the knowledge that we all seek ultimately, some kind of answer to the meaning of the Holocaust. And in the end, much like Primo Levi, perhaps the best we can do is to tell the story as best we can. Tell it over and over, from generation to generation, as we are doing right here and right now. Thank you very much. Glad to answer questions if there are questions. Yeah, Phil.
I'm curious about the fascist racial laws of 1938 in Italy, and if they came so, I mean, you seem to be arguing that Primo Levi didn't take them seriously, that his interpretation of them was a facile one. What further evidence can you give of that interpretation? In what way, since they came so late, one is tempted to think that Mussolini and his type, the fascists, didn't really take them all that seriously themselves, that they were only doing it to please Hitler or something.
Yeah. Well, a couple of points I'd like to make about that. First of all, first and foremost, this is one Matt with. I will argue with anybody about this one. The fascist racial laws that came in 1938 were not, those were Mussolini's doing. They were not Hitler's. My explanation would be that as many of these dictatorships functioned, they always had to have, the dictator always had to have one bigger act. An act, and then a still more exciting one, and there's still a more exciting one. One of the hottest down, one of the biggest shows, one that can really make headlines, is racism. It turns you against your neighbor. So, for my money, this was Mussolini's doing. Did the Italians, it was not inherent, I would argue, in the Italian fascist regime, not inherent as it was in Nazi ideology. With the Nazis, anti-Semitism was right there from the beginning. With the Italians, it wasn't there from the beginning, and one of the reasons that Primo Levi didn't take the fascist laws all that seriously is because most other Italians didn't take them seriously either, in the sense that they found them a nuisance. They didn't like them. They couldn't understand why they had to turn against their neighbors with whom they had been living peaceably for centuries, and they didn't want to be seen as being imitators of their neighbors up north, their allies up north, the Nazis. Were the racial laws enforced? Yes, they were. That's what the racial laws said, basically, there was a biological basis to them. Everybody was embarrassed by them, including Mussolini. He said that the racial laws were the treatise that went with them was sort of a bad treatise written in Italian, translated out of a bad German document, and that nobody really takes seriously. But, that is the theory of it. But the laws were enforced, that all civil servants were dismissed from their jobs. That included university professors, that included me. I mean, I wasn't, but my father was. So the racial laws were enforced. Primo Levi himself felt that he was being set aside. There were separate schools for Italian Jewish kids and so on. Nevertheless, as in Italy, and this is a cultural thing, as in Italy, you know, you smile and it's nice, and there's always you can always do things with a kind of wink. There were always exceptions, and the exceptions were in the law. That is, if you could show enough patriotic merits, you know, if your uncle or your husband or your brother had been in the First World War and fought for Italy, then even though you were Jewish, you could be exempt. Also, there were simply cases in which big-time fascists had Jewish girlfriends, Jewish mistresses. And when the laws were passed, there was one named Farinacci. When the laws were passed, people sort of turned to Farinacci and said, yeah, we know all about you and her. When are you going to get rid of her? And Farinacci got very angry. And he said, what do you mean, when am I going to get rid of her? I'm the one who determines who is Jewish around here. So the point here is the laws were enforced and not enforced. There were no roundups. There were no camps. None of that happened until 1943. Collapse of the fascist regime, then the roundups began. Now, you can make the argument, German occupation, that, well, that's just another example of another country under Nazi German occupation. So it really wasn't the Italians. What I would say, and the Germans did treat Italy, her nominal ally, simply as another occupied country. What I would say is yes and no. True, the roundup nasty stuff, the stuff that took away my grandmother, my Italian grandmother, October 16th, 1943, when the Rome ghetto was evacuated, shall we say. Then it was the Germans, but it was with the compliance of some Italians. Not all Italians, but there were Italians who collaborated with the Germans, who were enthusiastic, who remained red-hot fascists to the end. So I think that's what Primo Levi is referring to. The nature of the laws, they weren't inherent in the regime. They developed towards the end, and they were not popular. There's no question about that. And I will say, certainly, that many Italians did behave bravely, courageously. They did hide Jews and so on. So there's no question about that, including members of the church. One of the reasons that my grandfather survived was because he knew some people in the church. That was a long answer. Yeah.
Could the wording, the song that was sung during the Ethiopian War, Hacheta Negra, be used as as an indication that the Italians really don't have any talent inborn for racism.
For racism.
I mean, facetta, it's almost, it's not faccia, it's facetta.
Faccetta.
And it means
Faccetta nera della Abyssinia. Yeah. Make 2 points about that. That song was a song, Little Black Face, from Ethiopia. Essentially little black girl. First of all, this is the 90s. This is, any feminists around here is going to like that kind of terminology, faccetta nera della Abyssinia, very condescending. But in the context of the time, it is a soldier's song, and what it says, I think, is, on the one hand, there were racial policies in the colonies, and I would never want to forget that. There were racial policies in the colonies. They were colonial policies, and they're quite different from Nazi anti-Semitism. Two kinds of going on this one. Two different kinds of racism, I would say, many kinds, but two that I'd like to distinguish. One, the biological racism of the Nazis. You're born that way, it's in your blood, there's nothing we can do about it. You're out. If you're not with us, you're against us, it's a biological fact. Another form of racism, colonial racism, very common also in Western Europe. The one that said, we are bringing superior civilization to you, little faccetta nera, but there is hope for you. We will uplift you. We will help you out. Little brown brother or little brown sister. Very different. There is hope for some kind of reconciliation there. The Italians, of course, partook in both of the, I would say, of that colonial racism, probably more than the biological one. The biological one just didn't go over very well. But it doesn't mean that the Italians weren't racist in this sense of colonial racism. One more thing, they meant business as far as we can tell. Architectural plans. The architectural plans for the new colonial capital of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia would have included a totally segregated society. Okay, I do have to add that. Yes.
I was in Asmara during the war, Africa Italiana, and even though there was no direct discrimination, I was with the British, and we occupied Asmara, Keren, and then Asmara, and then Eritrea and Ethiopia.
You were with the British?
Yeah. We left all the people who were the employees of the former Italians in place, who ran everything. However, there wasn't a single dark person employed. There was the servants were the blacks, and it was a typical colonial. They were very kindly treated, and it was very nice, but there wasn't a single person employed by the Italians who did anything, any clerical, even clerical towards slavery.
So again, confirmation of this kind of colonial situation. Okay. Again, very common. I mean, this is very different, I would say, from the kind of colonial situation that the Nazis wanted to create in Eastern Europe, which really was a master-slave kind of situation. This is not what was typical of being colonialism. Sorry, yes.
Also, we have to remember, we're talking about 1943 in particular. The Americans were already in North Africa. And every Italian in Italy had a cousin in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and they were waiting for her. And every American battalion that walked in there always had Italian-speaking soldiers. So it was a big party. So by 43, they weren't interested in enforcing anything else, really. Not the people.
Yeah.
Sir, you made reference to the church's involvement in your family's
Yes.
in your family. From what you know, how long did it take for the Catholic Church to get involved in what was going on, and to what extent did the Catholic Church get involved in helping out the situation?
I'm sorry you asked that. It's a good question. The church is always a sticky issue. On the one hand, the fact that Italy was a Catholic country meant that the biological racism wasn't going to go over very well in terms of doctrine and theology, because what it meant was there's no way you can be saved. As far as the church itself involved in protecting the Jews and so on, I think what I would say is I've tried to work up some empathy for the Pope, for Pius XII. It's hard for me to do so. Pius XII, Papa Pacelli, was certainly, I think he was too timid. His argument was primarily, he had seen in 1918, 1919, as a papal nuncio in Germany, he had seen the horrors of Bolshevism. He was absolutely terrified of it. He had seen the socialist uprising in Germany. And this was something that marked him the rest of his life. So that he preferred to cut with authoritarian regimes rather than to deal with, or with Nazi fascist regimes, rather than dealing with godless atheistic communists. Having said that, so that people have often criticized him for his silences. I would be one of those to criticize him for his silence. Why didn't he speak out? There are good reasons. There is a defense to be made. The defense is simply that if he had spoken out, particularly in Rome, people have argued that the Germans really then would have probably invaded the Vatican. Even greater harm would have come to the church. There would have been all sorts of reprisals against Catholics in other countries, and so on. And therefore, the Pope felt that he had to protect his people. And I can understand that from an institutional point of view. Pius XII, the church, is not all of the church. The church is an institution, it's a hierarchy, and on the lower levels, there were many, many monsignors and so on, local priests, who did a great deal to help the Jews. And there is also evidence, I don't remember all the details on this, in which Pius XII said certain things, and yet it was clear that he was leaving a lot of room, a lot of latitude for the lower clergy. Now, we'll never know, what he really had in mind. But I would say that the lower clergy often did a great deal, simply in terms of hiding people, in terms of providing humanitarian aid during wartime and so on. The sorts of things that the Catholic Church has traditionally done. That the Catholics did that, they provided that. I personally, I would like to have, I wish he'd stood up on the ramparts or stood in the balcony in St. Peter's and said, no, this is evil. I will not accept this. He didn't do it. And I hope I've explained why. Yes?
Are you familiar with the book Christ in Dachau?
No.
Okay. There were 2,400 Christian clergymen, mostly Catholic priests, in Dachau. Hitler had hostages. He played the hostage game, and this is my estimation. You can read the book. We have the book here. It's on display in the library. And but basically, I feel he was told, all the records aren't now, he was told, you keep your mouth shut, but we're going to round, we've got 2,400 in now. Sure. We're going to round them up.
Sure.
It's all there in the book.
I think that's part of the story also. I mean, he was clearly aware of these kinds of reprisals. Sure. Any other questions? No student questions? Not even a teensy-weeny one? I was thinking of of course you're all students. I was thinking of the one sitting up in the peanut gallery. Okay, I think it's been a long afternoon. It's a spring day outside. Thank you very much.